Canada has significant solar and wind resources, and I'm going to be talking to Dan Balaban, who's the president and CEO of Greengate, one of Canada's biggest renewable energy developers, about just how we can go about developing those and what we can expect in the near to medium term around renewable energy. So welcome to the interview, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Markham. Thank you for having me.
So you're currently developing the Travers Project. It's a $700 million solar farm in Alberta. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yes, so we're developing the Travers Solar Project, which is going to be by far and away the largest solar project in Canada. It's a $700 million project that's currently well under construction in Vulcan County, which is between Calgary and Lethbridge, about 2 hours southeast of Calgary. You know, it's a massive development. I think it's it's a narrative-changing development. It'll consist of 1.3 million solar panels spread across 3,000 acres of farmland. And it's a massive project that I think will have a massive positive impact, on the environment, on the economy, the local community. I think it's really an example of the sort of projects that are win-wins in the future ahead as we go through the energy transition.
How much power will it actually produce?
Yeah, so it'll be capable of producing up to 465 megawatts onto the grid. It's got a DC capacity of almost 700 megawatts, so really massive. To put that into perspective, that provides enough power to supply the needs of more than 150,000 homes. So again, really significant project. But another really interesting thing about it is that Amazon is buying the majority of the power produced under the project under a long-term contract in order to meet their environmental objectives.
Now, Dan, one of the talking points I hear all the time on social media is, what happens when the sun goes down? And I see other jurisdictions down in the States where they've got, they've moved to bigger markets, so they can, when the sun does go down, they can get power from other areas. They're selling and buying power in a way that we don't do in Canada. But so what do we do in Alberta? What do we do in Canada when the sun goes down and the wind doesn't blow to offset the intermittency of renewables?
That's a very good question. Currently renewable energy is limited by the intermittent nature of its production. So there's a limit to the amount of renewable energy that we can have on the grid today. But I think it's really important to point out that there's no single source of power generation that can supply all of our needs consistently and reliably. We need to have a mix of power generation in the mix. However, I think going forward, we're going to see, increasing amount of renewable energy in the mix relative to what we've seen in the past. And, particularly with advancements around energy storage, I think that is a really key building block. The challenge that we have in the electrical system today is that energy can't be stored in large quantities in a economically viable manner. So the amount of energy we produce has to match the load at any given moment in time. It's a very complicated orchestra that our system operators all over the world have to go through. But energy storage allows solar energy to be stored, wind energy to be stored for later when those conditions don't exist, enabling that energy to be produced more consistently and reliably. And as we head towards our net zero goals going forward, I think that's going to be an increasingly important theme that we're going to be hearing about.
Well, speaking of storage, one of the proposals that the experts I've talked to are supporting is the idea of more east-west trade in Canada, particularly between the four western provinces where you've got BC Hydro on one end and Manitoba Hydro on the other, and then between Ontario and Quebec, of course, being a huge hydro producer. The idea that hydro can act as storage for renewables. What's your take on that?
Well, I think, the theory of it makes a lot of sense. But the reality is that's a very complicated thing to achieve in Canada. Every province, we're one country, but every province has its own jurisdiction over power generation and has its own unique market construct. Specifically, here in Alberta, we're the only deregulated power generation market in Canada. We have a truly competitive, power market, and investments have been made on that basis. And there's quite a bit of complexity around introducing, large quantities of power from other provinces, that may have been subsidized by their governments, and it just disrupts the competitive market framework. So that's a complex issue that needs to be worked out for that theory, to play out, that that hydro can be a great complement to renewables, which it is. But I think certainly the path of lesser resistance, here in Canada, is for each of the provinces, to build up the renewable capacity that they need, build out interconnections as they can, but I don't think that's going to solve it in the near to medium term. We need to build out a lot of renewable capacity so that we can meet our growing power demands as we move towards electrifying the world.
Now, we understand that Alberta and Saskatchewan have very good renewable resources, but what about other provinces? Like, what about British Columbia, which isn't going to build any more hydro dams? So where is its power going to come from? What about Ontario, which is currently grappling with, what it's going to do with its nuclear power plants? It's got gas power plants that are high emitting. So what about other provinces like that? Do they have adequate resources to build out renewable generation?
Absolutely. Renewable technology has come a long way and is, come down in cost to the point that it can be economic in places that don't have the best renewable energy resources in the world. Good enough resources. British Columbia and Ontario are examples of places like that. British Columbia and Ontario a while back, did procure, renewables, wind and solar in Ontario, wind in British Columbia. But those two provinces in particular become relative laggards as far as renewables growth. British Columbia has put its eggs in the large hydro basket with the Site C project. Ontario, has invested a lot in nuclear, but both those provinces are forecasted to, require more power as we electrify our economy. And I think it's time for, the incumbent, entities within those provinces, BC Hydro and, in Ontario, for them to, get on with it and start, procuring that renewable capacity that is going to be absolutely essential for us to, remain competitive and prosperous going forward.
So what about the cost of producing renewables in Canada, Dan? Because I interviewed Dwayne Hiley, who's the CEO of Tri-State Power Association, and his organization handles utilities in New Mexico, Wyoming, Colorado, I think. And he was telling me that for wind, their costs now are $10 a megawatt hour. For solar, they're under $20 a megawatt hour. What are we looking at in Canada, and does it vary by region?
Yeah, so the costs will certainly vary by region. Regions with relatively good renewable energy resources should have lower costs than regions with resources that are not as good. But generally speaking, renewable energy is cost competitive almost everywhere in the world nowadays. But there's important differences between the United States and Canada. In the United States, they have tax incentives for renewables, and they've had tax incentives for a really long time in the United States. And here in Canada, we don't have any. Just think about that. I mean, the narrative around renewable energy is one that we require subsidies to be economic. But in Canada and in Alberta, where we've been operating for 15 years, We've developed everything we have with no federal subsidy. So, very different sort of environment and counter to the narrative that we hear. That said, I believe if we want to remain, globally competitive and meet our very ambitious net zero goals that we've set for ourselves, we should have incentives of our own in Canada as well. The recent federal budget had some important announcements on these points. A tax credit for CCUS, which was very, quite high, and a lower tax credit for net zero technologies, and specifically no tax credit for renewables, only for certain types of net zero technologies. So I'm a little surprised actually by what I see as the disconnect between the ambition that our federal government is putting out there and the actual programs they're putting in place to support that ambition.
Well, that's very interesting. And since we're talking about subsidies, I still want to nail you down, if you can, on what it actually costs to produce a megawatt hour of by wind or solar in, say, your Travers project, which would be solar, of course.
Yes, so I can't talk about that specifically, but I can talk about some public announcements. So a number of years ago, the ISO in Alberta here put out an RFP for wind, and a number of projects were awarded long-term contracts for around $40 a megawatt hour. That's Canadian dollars. Solar tends to be a little bit pricier relative to wind, but because it produces during on-peak hours, it tends to produce more valuable energy. So all in all, it's also very competitive. But yeah, I mean, we've seen examples here of well-constructed projects with well-constructed policy framework that can deliver extremely low-cost power to consumers on a long-term basis.
Yeah, I remember that ISO auction. I think it was $38 a megawatt hour. So I guess based on what you're saying, we probably can assume that there's somewhere between $35 and $45 a megawatt hour, which is competitive with certainly with gas, and much more competitive than new hydro. If we look at Site C, which is going to be over $100 megawatt hour.
Yeah, I would say, just on that point, I think another thing that we need to understand is, the world's going through some pretty serious supply chain disruptions right now, and we're hearing about inflation hitting all of us in various ways. The renewable energy industry is not immune to those supply chain disruptions. So prices that you might have seen a few years ago have gone up recently, just like we've seen, everything go up. Even with those supply chain disruptions, we're still seeing prices that are very competitive. But I think it's important to note that at least in the near term, we're starting to see upward pressure on power pricing.
Sure. Well, Dan, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Markham.